Well, hello and welcome to the April live event for Essential Vegan Desserts. I'm Fran Costigan, and I'm very happy that those of you who are here have decided to spend the next hour or so with me. It's a really interesting, big ranging topic today if I use this ingredient instead of that. So I'm going to offer some information. Please send in your questions. I'd love to answer questions. I like things to be interactive. I might ask you to follow up with a question. I might have a question about your question and so on. But before I dive into this really interesting, let's call it interesting topic, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping. If you have a question, on the right-hand side of your screen, the question queue is there, and you can just put your question into there. I want to welcome all of our guests, graduates of Essential Vegan Desserts and other Rouxbe programs, and people who may have just are in the program now. I see a couple of people that I know, so thank you for being here. I want to remind the students in the Essential Vegan Desserts course to read the criteria for each assignment. They differ, and part of the grade that I can give is based on your meeting the criteria. If you have any questions, anybody that's here, whether you're in a Rouxbe course or not, feel free to send an email to me at fran@rouxbe.com. I'd be happy to have a conversation with you or answer some questions, anything at all. So definitely reach out to me that way if you like. And I must say, I have had some uploads of assignments, some of our capstone. I'm having trouble. I'm going to tell you something. I had a little dental emergency this morning, so I'm just coming back from it, but I'm fully here. But the final assignment for Essential Vegan Desserts is a dessert showcase, and it's 5 mini bites. Student picks a theme, and of course, during the stay at home, we weren't able to do entertaining, but the showcases have been magnificent, really magnificent. And people thinking out of the box and doing very, very clever things. So I want to give a shout out to everyone who is doing that and sending those in. Again, any questions? Just write to me, fran@rouxbe.com. If you're in the course, there's a Q&A for questions, and you might find that one of your questions has been answered. So before I get to the topic, well, actually, this is part of the topic, but I want to point out to you that there is an event document for muffins. Patrick has a photo of the muffins, and join me in thanking Patrick, our wonderful producer at Rouxbe, who saves the day every time there were some technical problems at my end, and Patrick just fixed them. So what I have here is 3 different pats of butter, and what they are is written underneath so that I will remember. Now it's 4 o'clock or 4:05 Eastern Standard Time. To give you some context, I put these pats of butter straight from the refrigerator, in one case I think from the freezer, in these little dishes at just short of 2 o'clock. So it's been 2 hours. And this is going to be, I think, a visual explanation of, does it matter if I use this ingredient instead of that, or one? This is, and I hope you can see it, this is a pat of Miyoko's butter, not the oat butter, but the stick butter, or I call it a stick butter, even though it comes in a block. And you can see that the oil is separating out. It's been at room temperature for just 2 hours now. It is a delicious butter. It is not made with any palm oil, and some of the ingredients that I know there are people who want to stay away from palm oil, even if it's considered sustainably sourced. But I think that you could see, based on all this liquid that has leaked out, that this would not be the best choice for making a buttercream that has to hold up. to use this butter, you would really, this vegan butter, well, everything here is vegan, so I'm just not going to say vegan. You would have to add some shortening or use less. Really, you'd have to add some shortening. This one is Earth Balance. I personally don't use Earth Balance. It's just, we all have different ideas about flavor. I don't like the flavor, but this is Earth Balance Buttery Sticks. I'm going to put my gloves on in a little while and touch these butters, and it looks like it's holding up. And the one that really holds up the most, the best, that can be used to make even puff pastry is this Flora butter. That's Flora. Now, there are reasons that people want to use, people who use fat, because vegan butter is fat, want to use one or the other. The Flora and the Earth Balance are made with some palm oil. Flora has a sustainable statement. I don't know about Earth Balance. I imagine that they do. So that's one example. Here is agar powder. Agar is an important foundational ingredient in making vegan desserts, much more than for just making gelled desserts. We use this in combination with a starch slurry to make a nice creamy result. And so it's a real foundational ingredient. Now, this is a natural product and tests have to be made. This is Now Foods. It works great. You can get it most everywhere. This one says Super Agar. I haven't used it yet, but I'm going to assume that this has a stronger strength than this one. I always talk about doing a test. We have some agar assignments early on in the course. You make the gel, whether it's a firm gel that can be cut or a soft gelled soup. You take a little bit out before you commit to your dish, put it in the refrigerator, a little bowl like this, a tablespoon, wait 5-10 minutes, then if the gel, after it has chilled and set, is firmer than you want it to be, you add more liquid. If it's softer than you want it to be, you add more agar. Now, agar is a sea vegetable. There are no calories. It is said to be soothing to the digestive tract, but it's made from seaweed. This is one form. Agar, there are 3 forms of agar. They're all a little different. I don't see the sticks very much anymore. I used them when I was working as a pastry chef in Angelica Kitchen. We would get them wet and shred them in. The flakes are wonderful. They have to be hydrated. Or think of it like blooming bovine gelatin. You don't get agar powder by powdering the flakes. Agar powder is 3 to 4 times as strong as agar flakes. So here are 2 ingredients that if you switch them out, they would definitely make a difference. So I'm going to go back now and start with this statement. And I think that I know that sometimes it makes people unhappy, but it is the truth that every change makes a difference. Every change makes a difference. Now, in some pastry courses, the French pastry course, for example, which is at Rouxbe, the French pastry school, wonderful school, very clearly defined. The butter that's specified in that course is 84%. The flour that's specified in the course is a particular flour with a set protein value. We are getting much wider, we have a much wider arena to draw from in the vegan world, but it's not quite that set. So we have to do a lot of testing because what you want is something that is reliable, that will work the same way every single time. You want to have an understanding of what's going on before you go and start doing your own variations. That's really important. This course is about foundational technique. And we do have people who have dietary considerations within the course. It is not a gluten-free course, but we have many students who have been gluten-free and able to go through the course. There might be an assignment or two that they haven't been able to swap around, but unless they're celiac, I recommend that they make the assignment as written so you have a baseline. Once you start swapping things out, you can go back to that baseline, even if somebody else has tasted it for you, and you can smell it, you can feel the texture, you can observe the texture. One of the things that I love about doing desserts, cooking in general, but particularly desserts, is that you use all of your senses. So that's a really important thing. I have, oh, this is heavy, all these different sweeteners. These are liquid sweeteners. Well, of course, they're going to be different from the granulated sweeteners just because they're liquid, but they aren't necessarily able to be swapped one for one. They have different properties, different tastes, and they work very differently. One does not necessarily work for the other, and here are the granulated sweeteners. So I've got organic coconut palm sugar, which many people like and use as a replacement for brown sugar. I've got whole cane sugar, which is sugar cane with all of the molasses intact. I have some maple sugar, which is super expensive, was given to me as a gift, which was really nice. I would use this only where a maple taste is desired. Maple sugar is nothing more than maple syrup with the water evaporated off. This is confectioner sugar, and I pulled this particular one. I use wholesome sweets more than I use Florida crystals because, let me put this down, vegan confectioner sugar is typically made with tapioca starch, not with cornstarch, and it takes more sifting, so you might have to sift it twice. This Florida crystals confectioner sugar is made with cornstarch, the same way that let's say supermarket or non-vegan confectioner sugar is made. So these are all things you really want to know about. Chocolate, for sure. The right chocolate to use is the one that tastes good when you munch it right out of the package, but you have to stay within the percentage that's listed in the recipe to get a reliable result. Once you follow the recipe and you know what a ganache made with a 70 to 72% chocolate looks like, then you can start experimenting if you're going to want to go to an 85. I wouldn't go beyond that. There are things you can do, but first learn the basics. I'm looking down at this butter and it's really a puddle now. When you're taking a recipe that you're taking a standard recipe. I hardly like to say standard anymore because I think vegan is really becoming a new standard. If you've been aware at all, vegan is really a big thing now. It's not a trend anymore, that's for sure. But if I'm looking at a recipe to adapt, let's say my mother-in-law's recipe, my mother-in-law was a great baker. My mother, no, she wasn't at all. And the recipe calls for a certain amount of butter, dairy butter, and I'm swapping it out to oil. I use 3/4 of the amount of oil. Why? Not to use less fat necessarily, but dairy butter has milk solids in it, and oil is 100% fat. So when I'm using a vegan butter, I consider that as well, because once it's melted down, that's pretty much going to happen. Now, some of you may have heard of a frosting called ermine frosting. It's also called a cooked flour frosting. It's really old-fashioned. And it's something that I had never really made, but it's, sometimes they say everything old is new again. So I saw a recipe for ermine frosting, AKA cooked flour frosting, pudding frosting, And I like the idea of it because it uses quite a bit less sugar than American buttercream. I'm not a big fan of American buttercream. I don't like really sweet desserts, but this is an essential vegan desserts course. Of course, we're going to teach you how to make an American buttercream. So I thought, well, let me just give this a try. There's a lot less sugar in it. Now, I did not try it with gluten-free flour yet, and it's really, I found it quite easy to make as long as you really pay attention. It takes time. First, you cook together, you mix together a certain amount of flour, AP flour, and cane sugar. And then the recipe says, you can all find this at kingarthur.com, ermine frosting. And then I'll tell you what I did. And then it called for flour, sugar. Both of those are vegan. I mean, the sugar can be vegan, 1, 2, 3. And it said whole milk. So I started looking at the back of my plant milk containers. I wanted the one with the most fat to mimic whole milk. And I chose the Oatly Original, which has more fat than the Oatly low fat. And I thought, I did some calculations. I'm really not good with math, but I did some calculations, and the Oatly Original still didn't have the same fat that whole milk had. So I added a little bit of butter to the milk and to enrich it. The recipe is all about temperature. So thinking about what is an ermine frosting, if anybody here is familiar with a Swiss meringue buttercream, which we can do with aquafaba, it's kind of like that. You take this roux, it's really a roux that you've cooked, and then let it cool. I mixed it, I beat it with not with the whisk, with the beater blade in my KitchenAid mixer. Of course, I cut the recipe in half because I didn't want to commit to a whole recipe, just wanted to see how it would work. And I beat it, and I have an infrared thermometer, and I kept checking the temperature. And once it was under 70 degrees, I took the butter, which had to be at 70 degrees or lower, and added it a little at a time. For this recipe, I chose the Flora butter because I wanted something that would hold up. The Miyokos in this case would not hold up. However, one of my really brilliant students wanted to make palmier, which is a puff pastry dessert. She didn't want to use any vegan butter with palm oil. She wanted to use Miyokos. She melted it down with some cacao butter, which is pure fat and is more solid. And she made butter that would work. So these are terrific things to think about. Anyway, I just kept beating, and it's like velvet. It reminded me of the filling in a whoopie pie. So I will definitely be doing that again. But the next test will also be a half, and I'll be using my Bob's Red Mill 1-to-1 all-purpose baking flour to see how it works for a gluten-free version. I imagine it would be fine. In this case, because the sugar is dissolved, it's cooked into it's like making a pudding, really. I tasted it, and it tasted like a pudding. You don't have to use the organic cane. You could use coconut sugar. It's going to melt. You're going to get a darker result, of course, or you could use whole cane sugar, I'm sure, but you want to use one of the granulated sugars. So I'm going to stop here and start taking a couple of questions. So Susan K wants to know, what are the best plant milks to make plant-based heavy cream-like recipes? Well, Susan, you want something with the approximate fat content of heavy cream. The closest to that, and we have actually a listing in this course of the fat contents of various milks and creams, would be full-fat coconut milk. Now, not everyone likes the flavor of coconut. If you're doing something else with the heavy cream, if you're flavoring, that won't be a problem. Flora cream is the only non-dairy vegan cream I've seen that whips like whipped cream. It's made with pea protein or fava beans. They're reformulating it now. And there is a shop in Philadelphia called V Marks the Shop, a vegan grocery store. And they carry Flora. It can be difficult to find, I'm told. I got some samples and it whipped just like whipped cream and tasted really good too. You can probably buy it on Amazon or look for it. But other than that, you need something that's rich. You could use a nice, rich cashew cream. That would work as well. I hope that answers your question. Hannah wants to know, do you have a vegan vanilla icing recipe for your vanilla cake? She's not a chocolate ganache kind of person, and she doesn't like buttercream icings. So Hannah, this is just music to my ears, what she wrote. She said, I understand and will resort to a bit of experimenting. Well, yeah. So this ermine frosting that I'm talking about is perfect because it's a vanilla type frosting, and it's definitely not as sweet as American buttercream. Or a Swiss meringue buttercream could work, or a lemon. I like to do a lemon glaze on my vanilla cake. I'm a chocolate person. I'm a vanilla person. I really like lemon as well, or a cream cheese icing. So keep us posted, Hannah. So Sally's looking, great question. And I'm not surprised. Sally wants to know, what's the best egg replacement in sugar cookie cutouts? Energy seems to cause them to spread. Flax seed adds flex she doesn't want. I tried cornstarch and water and it didn't work. Or it worked, but the dough was crumbly. Sally, this is like the $1 million question. So I'm going to tell you, we have a whole unit on egg replacement in this course because it's so important. Now, 25 years ago, there were no commercial egg replacers. Nobody heard about, there was no aquafaba even until a few years ago, and nobody was doing flax and water or chia and water. I can tell you that because I was working as a pastry chef. So there are recipes that are made without egg replacers, but if the flax seed added flex and it worked, try white chia, that might work. Today we don't really have to reinvent the wheel. There are a lot of really reliable vegan dessert recipes. Now, I'm not saying, in fact, I'm saying the opposite. Don't go and do an internet search and pull some recipe and you don't know the person and you can't look at the reviews and so on. Find a tried and true. Ju Diva wrote a book called Aquafaba. She did a live event, so anybody here who is in Ruby can access that live event. And she has a sugar cookie that is absolutely fabulous. It really rolls out beautifully and it cuts into shapes. I've made it. It's really great. And their Aquafaba is the egg replacer. You can go to self.com/egg replacers and look at that article. I was asked to offer my opinions and as well as several other vegan pastry chefs. And I love that article because when I say, well, there's no one size fits all, and I know sometimes people are really disappointed, but it's the truth. It was very interesting for me to see that even among ourselves, and we are all pastry chefs doing recipes that work, there were some different ways of seeing things. So it's super interesting. Teresa says, I have trouble with my cakes being so dense using flaxseed egg substitute and dates as sweetener. Well, Teresa, I would need more information from you than that because I don't know what kind of flour you're using. I don't know about your recipe, but I can say this. Again, going back to the idea of the egg replacer, flax egg substitute is really a binder. It doesn't help with the rising. And if you're using dates as a sweetener, This sounds like the kind of recipe that would be maybe a whole food plant-based no oil recipe, and you're going to get a certain amount of denseness. Now, I'm going to take a couple more questions, then I'm going to show you what I made and go through the process, because I did make something with maple syrup, but with some dates and some bananas and things. It takes a lot of testing. The fluffiest cakes, the cakes with the most delicious mouthfeel, the kinds that would be on the Great British Baking Show, are made with flour and some kind of sweetener, maple syrup, granulated sweetener, not date sugar. Date sugar is dried and pulverized dates. It's not really a sugar. It doesn't dissolve in cakes. And so that's not one to use. We use date paste in this course, but not necessarily as a sweetener. I've had some students who told me that they really thin the date paste to make it more like a maple syrup or a date syrup. You might want to try, Teresa, you might want to try date syrup, which is steamed dates. And it's a lovely molasses, like a light molasses tasting, but you're just going to have to, I wish I had an answer for you, but send me some more, put some more information about your cake and we'll see if we can troubleshoot it. Sally has another question. What adjustments need to be made to use pastry flour in place of AP? Also, is the protein difference between cake and pastry flour noticeable? That's a great question. I use AP flour and I use whole wheat pastry flour, and generally I use 50% of each measure in a batter-based dessert. Sometimes I use all whole wheat pastry flour. Sometimes I use all AP. It depends who I'm feeding. I notice a slight difference when I'm using the whole wheat pastry flour, which isn't whole wheat flour. The protein difference isn't tremendous. Actually, I have it right here on my document. AP flour is typically 9.5 to 12%. It might surprise you that that's a lower protein than whole wheat pastry flour or any pastry flour, which is 7 to 9%. And I think King Arthur white pastry flour, which I don't use, is 8%. I don't use cake flour, but when I want to use cake flour, when I want to make something even more tender, I'll take a bit of the flour out and add some cornstarch or arrowroot. So you shouldn't have to do too much subbing, but the answer really is for you to divide the recipe in half, maybe by a quarter, write every single change down, because for sure you're going to forget one change, and scale your ingredients and then see how it tastes. When I show you these muffins and this document that you are free to download, I just kept testing. So good luck with that. Lydia wants to know, can ground flax seeds be an egg replacer for vegans? Flax is vegan, so it can. It is one of the egg replacers, but it doesn't give any, it's more of a binder than it is, in my mind, as an egg replacer. It's good in muffins and denser cakes. I use chia gel and flax gel interchangeably myself. Laura wants to know, how do I feel about monk fruit as a sweetener, erythritol? So I talked about this in another live event, and actually for people who are in Essential Vegan Desserts, I just added some more information to the chapter to talk about these sweeteners. This is personal. I don't use them. I don't like them. I find an aftertaste. I find they work differently. Monk fruit is always used with another sweetener. One of them, I don't know if it's erythritol or xylitol, one of them will kill your dog if your dog gets into it. So you want to be really careful about that. I know there are more people using it. I was sent some allulose, to try, which is the newest of these they're not, they're not the ones in the little pink packets that are really bad for us. They're not chemicals, but these are actually quite highly refined. Most of them, not Monk. Monk is low Han, needs a lot of processing to get the very bitter taste out of the fruit, which is what keeps the birds and off the berries. And erythritol, xylitol, and allulose are all manufactured from corn. Most of the manufacturers say non-GMO corn. They were naturally occurring on some fruits, but that's not the ones that you use. So most of the manufacturers, most of the information about using these ingredients, the erythritol, xylitol, allulose, are going to say start slowly because you can get a stomach ache. So you want to start slowly. You're definitely going to have to change your recipes up. Laura says, when short on time and relying on store-bought plant milks, is there one plant source that's less processed than the others? It depends on the brand. So when I happen to like soy milk, it's fatty, it's healthy. I buy West Soy. It's just soybeans and water. That's it. So you want to read the back of the carton. I have an almond milk behind me because sometimes I have them in my pantry as well. And I picked one up. It was one I didn't know, but it said vegan, it said fair trade, it said all the right things. And when I looked at it, it said it was processed with dairy. So that was surprising to me. So, you have to look, because I think even hemp milk can have other things in it that you don't necessarily like. I really use oat milk the most, and I use Oatly oat milk. And the reason I like it, it's slightly sweet, which is nice for desserts. It creams things very nicely. It's very reliable. And it works for people who are, I make assumptions that there will be people who are soy avoiders, that there are people who are allergic to nuts. I think hemp milk has a grassy taste that I don't always like, but I do use it. I did a demo for Chef AJ. Some of you may know AJ. You can find it on her YouTube channel, where I challenged myself to make a cream without cashews or tofu. And I used hemp, oats, rolled oats, and dates as the base. And it was okay. It needed a lot of flavoring up. So there you go. Read labels, whether it's your chocolate or your anything, because things sneak in that are really surprising. Catherine wants to know, is it possible to make a vanilla cake with dates, whole wheat pastry flour, and oil that's tasty enough for a Boston cream pie? You're going to have to, I want to say that we all have different ideas about what tastes delicious or so-so or not so good. And when you see the number of muffins that I made testing all these things, you're going to have to decide. My palate over these years has definitely changed. I don't like really sweet things. I can taste salt tremendously when I'm buying food or in restaurants. I'm very sensitive to that. But in terms of the vanilla cake with dates, you can make it with whole wheat pastry flour, that's for sure. I don't know is the answer, because I haven't done it. I think that with no oil at all, I think it's conceivably a problem. You can try putting some applesauce. I have some students who say they've used applesauce in it. Catherine, cut the recipe in half, cut it by 1/4. You have to maintain the integrity of the recipe, so you still have to bake a cake-like thing, even if it's a couple of cupcakes, and find out and let me know. Liza wants to know, at what do you draw the line and attempt not to veganize a recipe? That's a really interesting question. Well, a recipe that's made with 5 eggs and up, or sometimes 4 eggs and up, I'm not going to try to veganize it. At this point, I've been able to veganize the things that I like, for the most part. Not an angel food cake. Nobody that I know has cracked that code yet. Maybe it's coming. There are also, that's a great question, Liza. There are also ingredients that are used by some of the pastry chefs who are vegan pastry chefs who are doing magnificent work, but they are ingredients that I don't use, because I still try to use ingredients that are as whole as possible. Now, some of you may think, well, she's using cane sugar, organic cane. That's not very whole. I use just enough sweetener, just enough oil or fat if I'm doing something with fat, so that it tastes good. You know, I've told this story a lot, but when I was first made the transition, and I was so excited, and, you know, I was coming from a place where for a month or so, I was like, desserts are the devil. And I was working as a pastry chef, and my boss said, Costigan, you're making brownies, not brown bread. Put some of the sugar back in the brownies. You can cut the amount of sugar. In most older recipes, people were using a lot more sugar than we use today. You can't cut it out completely. You're just going to have to go step by step. So Jeremiah says, for buttercream, I ran out of confectioner sugar. Will I be able to use pure cane sugar? That's a terrific question to ask. No, you can't. Confectioner sugar is powdered. It's powdered very finely. When my recipes all say lightly grind or finely grind your sugar, depending on the recipe. So, for example, this is powdered sugar in the dry bowl of my Vitamix, but it's not powdered sugar. Like, you can feel the difference. Powdered confectioner sugar, it really tastes like baby powder, feels like baby powder in your fingers. The starch in it is there to keep it from caking. No matter how much you beat your buttercream, you're going to taste the gritty sugar. I'm pretty sure of it, Jeremiah. Now, Catherine can't eat chocolate. Do you use Carob? And what's my favorite brand? That's another really interesting question. I haven't made something with Carob in years. I used to when I was working as a pastry chef at Angelica Kitchen. We weren't allowed to use chocolate, and we had Carob recipes. And I think in my book, More Great Good Dairy-Free Desserts, I have some Carob recipes. You know, tofu and tempeh, they're both made from soybeans, but they're different. And that's what I say about Carob and chocolate. They're both kind of brown, but they're very different. Carob, my kids actually have a carob tree in LA, and they call it the sweet tree. The deer like to come up and eat them. So I don't have a favorite brand. Just do some research and see what people see, the reviews that people have. What can make carob taste much, much better is roasting it first. So you spread it out on a parchment lined baking pan and roast it in a low oven. The edges will get hard, and then you need to cool it and powder it. But that works the best. Also, carob is sweeter than unsweetened cocoa powder. So you're going to do some adjustments. I want to just alert everyone who's here that a lot of the, carob has a perception of being healthier than chocolate. If you're allergic to chocolate, you can't eat it. That's another story. But a lot of the carob confections in the market are made with unhealthful ingredients. So Susan wants to make a plant-based cake she had in Australia. That's an almond flour, orange blossom pistachio cake. It was vegetarian. It sounds delicious. Those flavors are delicious. But what's the best method to replace 6 eggs? Let's all say you can't. You just can't, Susan. That's too many eggs to replace. So What I would do is I would look for an already tested almond orange cake. You can easily add some pistachio flour to it and get the flavors that you want in a cake that's already vegan. Now, on my website, I actually have a cake. It's called Big Orange Bunch, and it's just fabulous. It's really a wonderful cake. Joe Yonan made a version of it in his book, Cool Beans. But over time, sometimes I say, and I think this is some advice I want to give you, when you get something to a certain place, say, no more testing. This is it. But I wanted to see what would happen if I put use some almond flour in that cake, and it was luscious. So you can maybe use that as a template. I'm so sorry, but you cannot replace 6 eggs in a recipe. So KB wants some suggestions for salt substitutes. With these muffins, and I really want to get to that, there was only 1/8 of a teaspoon in the half recipe that I made. And I made some without the salt, and they tasted really flat. It's really easy, though, to leave the salt out in food. You want to enhance the flavors of pasta and rice dishes, up your spices, up your spice game, and you shouldn't have a problem at all. Kathy Hester, Hester, has a lot of advice on how to replace salt with spice mixes. So Myra says, thank you for the helpful tips. I'm glad that you're enjoying this. Can I just replace guar gum with xantham? Yes. Technically, no. I was on a cruise. I was making dessert for a lot of people. There was no xantham gum. I don't even remember what I was making, but I know I needed it. I got a hold of the people at Bob's Red Mill, and they said, of course, you can find this out online, and they said there's a slight difference. I use them interchangeably, and I don't have a problem. So just replace it with the xantham, and it'll be fine. Myra says, for a few months now, I make my own soy milk. I don't have a favorite use for okara anymore because you're really cool. I haven't been making it, but I don't have any soy pulp ideas. Maybe somebody here does, but there's a lot of things to do with pulp in desserts. After I do a juice, I use the pulp. I'll dry it out a little bit and incorporate it into a dessert in the way that I would nuts. And I do the same thing if I'm making almond milk or another nut milk that's got residue. Even oat milk, I'll use that. So I think it's the same idea. So Linda says she has a difficulty digesting nightshade vegetables. Well, back in the day when I changed my diet, and I was really, it was a long time ago. I didn't know the word vegan, so I think I was following a strict macrobiotic diet, no fish. And we used to make a beet tomato sauce because a bunch of us were learning about nightshades and not eating that. So there are people, it was called a no-mato sauce. I remember it was beets and carrots. It was sweet. And then the seasonings you'd use in an Italian sauce, we made ketchup that way, eggplant and bell peppers and white potatoes. Expand the kinds of vegetables. There's so many vegetables to eat. White potatoes, for some period of time, I was avoiding potatoes, but I love potatoes now. And so does Dr. McDougall. I like purple potatoes. I like sweet potatoes. I like the Japanese potato that looks white inside, but isn't a white potato. So why don't you try those? Marianne says she's trying to use as much whole wheat flour in recipes with mixed results. Well, whole wheat flour is good for bread. It's not good for desserts, if that's what you mean. I use whole wheat pastry flour. So I'm going to put a pin in your questions right here and start talking about these muffins. So this is just a tiny amount of what I did for this test. So here's one that was baked in a paper right in this tin. This one was baked also in a paper, but in a silicone. This one, I had to do a little bit of tasting, but you can see when I taste, I don't take big tastes, but you taste it when it's warm and you taste it when it's cool and you taste it the next day and so on. This one was baked directly in the silicone and so on. That's just a few. These were baked without salt, with other substitutions, and I didn't like them. They're not horrible. I'm not throwing them away. I'll probably toast them. My grandkids are coming this weekend, so they called this particular muffin Fran muffin, and they make them themselves. They're really healthy. So I'm going to look at this so I don't forget, and I think this will explain how I make changes. So this says original recipe in More Great Good Dairy-Free Desserts Naturally had 2 tablespoons of whole cane sugar. That could be swapped out with coconut sugar. But the sweetener in this recipe is primarily maple. It's maple syrup. Somewhere along the line, I decided to see if I could lose that 2 tablespoons of cane sugar, and it was fine. Did I make the whole recipe? No, I made a quarter of the recipe. I liked the way it tasted. I don't always want to take a recipe that's really tried and true and do what I did to this one, but because of this event, I wanted to. So I made a half recipe, okay? And on the document, I have half and full, and I have gram weight because it's just easier to divide. It's much more accurate. You don't have to stop and think, what's half of 1 1/3 cups? And measuring cups and so on are not always so accurate. In a recipe like this, I don't think it matters as much as in a delicate cake, but I gave you all of that. So now I have a half recipe, right, of this batter. The recipe calls for, a full recipe calls for only 2 tablespoons of oil. And this is for a recipe that makes about 18 muffins and a lot of mini muffins. What I did was I mixed up the batter, I measured it. I wanted to see how much it made, and I weighed it. I divided it in half. To 1/2, which is now 1/4, I added a tablespoon of oil. To the other half, which is a quarter, the same quarter, I added a tablespoon of date paste on the loose side. I make my date paste, my prune paste, my apricot paste kind of thick because I can always thin them down. And I baked them, and I made sure that I remembered which was which. I actually color-coded them. So I wrote that down. And I baked a few of each right in silicone, right in the metal pan, and in paper liners, because that makes a difference too. Low fat, and even with the oil in this recipe, it's a low fat recipe. You're going to have trouble getting the paper off your cupcake or muffin. So one thing that I can tell you for sure is let the cakes cool completely. If you've baked in a paper, let them cool completely and then ease it out carefully, and it works. I saved the paper to show you. I got it off. Okay. And then I made myself a note that says you could try it with, instead of maple syrup, you could try it with date syrup, which is also known as Ceylon, S-L-I-A-N. It's an ancient food. That's going to change the flavor. I don't think it's going to change the consistency. It's going to have more of a molasses flavor and a bit less sweet. So I have first impression while hot. The date paste muffins were softer in the silicone, but the metal pan was firmer. More firmer. I mean, I like that. Was it a really big difference? No. I wrote, don't try to peel the paper until the muffin's cool. How did I know that? Well, I know that in general, as I said, with the low-fat muffins and cupcakes, that's the case, but I wanted to make sure, and so I tried to peel one while it was warm. What my conclusion was that if you're making a recipe that only has 1 tablespoon of oil in it, you can leave it out. I didn't do it. I would love for somebody to do it and get back to me, but I'm positive that that small amount of oil in a recipe like this would be fine. The date paste here wasn't just a sweetener. It was really to replace the oil. You could do that with applesauce, maybe. If you wanted a more neutral taste, I thought that the date gave it a little bit of a fruity flavor, and that's what I did. So I wanted to make something where I was reducing the sweetener, where I was using only maple syrup and not a ton of it. Oats are sweet, and banana is sweet. I used frozen banana. I just mashed it up, and I used all the liquid in it. If you're high altitude, you might have to make some other changes. We've added a high altitude unit in Essential Vegan Desserts to accommodate our students who are baking at high temperatures. And that's, and that's the way that muffin rolled. So I'm going to put them in the freezer. I know they freeze beautifully because I know I used to keep them in the freezer as, I'm an oatmeal steel cut oats person for breakfast, fully loaded with blueberries and flax and sometimes pumpkin seeds. But there were times where I'm really rushing where I'd grab 1 or 2 of these to take with me. And, I'm not an energy bar kind of person. And it's really a nice recipe. And the flour is 100% whole wheat pastry flour. You could use spelt if you wanted. I don't think you're going to have much of a difference. Spelt flour is said to be more easily digested by people with some wheat situations, but it is definitely wheat. It is not gluten-free. It's wheat. It's unhybridized wheat. And I also have whole wheat pastry flour that is a heritage. It's Sonora grain, and it's impact grinding instead of steel, and the protein content is the same, but it works a little bit differently. So it's not my intention here to get people going, oh, I don't even want to get started. There's so much you can do. You find a recipe that works and be happy with it. But if you want to see, well, I wonder what I can do to take out the maple syrup, maybe I'll try rice syrup. No, then you say to yourself, no, because rice syrup bakes gummy. It's not, I love the taste of rice syrup. It tastes like caramel to me, but it bakes up gummy. It makes some cookies crisp. That's why there's a recipe in the course for tuile, very lacy tuile. That's a combination of rice syrup and maple syrup. So you get to know these different sweeteners. You can go ahead, Vicki, and use all whole wheat pastry flour. The only place I don't love it is in the oil-based pie dough. I think no matter what you do, it doesn't taste good. But at the same time, using all AP flour in that oil-based pie dough doesn't taste good either. So Vicki wants to know best advice for a newbie to the plant-based lifestyle. Asking for a friend. So you've been whole food plant-based for 10 years. You probably have plenty of advice for your friend. I would say encourage them, because they're going to feel a lot better once you start feeling better. You want to keep going. The Rouxbe founders have a program now called Switch. I think maybe Patrick can put the link in there. It's a free website with tons of whole food plant-based recipes, and it's really fun. So you can do that as well. And cook for your friend, there are so many resources. There are so many books. Maybe your friend wants to take Culinary RX, just dip their toes in at Rouxbe. So that's really terrific. Mary, hi, Mary. It's good to see you. When cooking with EVOO, I use, you're saying for a recipe is to 1 cup of butter, 3/4 of a cup of EVOO. Yeah, that's what I use when I'm doing vegan baking. Absolutely. Mary knows a lot about olive oil, EVOO. So Alessi says, I want to make my cakes without wheat flour. You're trying to avoid starches. What's the most natural leavening? Alessi, if I'm saying your name wrong, I apologize. Well, if you're saying you don't want to use wheat flour, I'm thinking that you want to use gluten-free flour baking mixes. You can make your own. We have a recipe in the Essential Vegan Desserts, or you can buy a go-to that works really reliably, and that is Bob's Red Mill with the blue label. It's called 1-to-1 AP baking flour mix. It's complete. You don't have to add any Guar or Xantham. It's really good. In terms of trying to avoid starches, just find recipes that don't use starch. If you want to make a cake without flour, without starch, and natural leavening, I don't really know what what you mean specifically by natural leavening. Baking powder, baking soda, and vinegar are what leavens our vegan cakes when we're not using an egg replacer. It works really great. There's nothing unnatural about those leaveners. They sound unnatural, but before they were discovered, people's cakes were flat as can be. So flax and chia bind, they don't leaven. The article Dawn wants to know, do you mean about the egg replacer? I think Dawn must mean about the egg replacer. It's just go self.com egg replacers and the article will come up. How to make a vegan white cake batter. I have a vanilla cake that's as white as it gets, Linda, in my cookbook, Great Good Dairy-Free Desserts Naturally, and we have one in Essential Vegan Desserts. When you're using vegan sweeteners or cane sugar, some small amount of the molasses is retained. So it's really hard to get a pure white, but people are really doing it. Somebody here might have a suggestion for that. Sally, Linda says she makes rollout sugar cookies and doesn't use egg or egg replacer. The recipes from Veg News website. Thank you, Linda. That's really helpful. I haven't used tiger nut and the cassava flour. I have. This is a good question, Scott. Scott wants to know, can you use it on your own, or is it better to be mixed into other gluten-free flours? It's always better to do a mix. It's always better to do a mix. And that holds true with these sweeteners like erythritol, xylitol, allulose. It's better to do a mix. So Vicky says potatoes are whole food carbs. We need that for energy. Well, I agree. But if somebody can't eat white potatoes or is staying away from nightshades, then there are other places they can get their carbs. Linda, I didn't realize, I know Linda from the course, I didn't realize until this point that you were at high altitude. So Linda says she's always experimenting, and she agrees with me to make half recipes. Linda wrote this in our Essential Vegan Desserts Facebook group. By the way, if there's anybody here in Essential Vegan Desserts that hasn't yet joined the Facebook group, please do. It's a great, lively place. It's a wonderful place. So this is really interesting to me about high altitude. I had a friend who was at high altitude. I don't know how high, but she was in Colorado somewhere, and she made my chocolate cake to live for, and she said spilled all over her kitchen. So I did some research. We figured something out. Now, that was many, many years ago, and I don't know what kind of baker she is even to start with, but now we have, real information in the course. Recently, I did a class for students in Denver, and I asked the chefs, I said, this is the high altitude information that I use. I don't know if it's the same as you, but before the demo day comes, I think you ought to try this cake and this cake in your school oven and see what happens and make the adjustments. And they said no adjustments were needed. So it's really test, test, test. And that you really can't get around that. It's really fun. But I mean, it's fun when you get a result that works. It's not so much fun. It gets really frustrating, right? On a day when it doesn't work. It's more frustrating for me when I'm on deadline, but I try to pay full attention and get myself set up. And that means having a complete mise en place. Because even with recipes that I know in my mind, I've made them so many times, I write every single thing down and I mise. And I get myself in a head, and I don't multitask. I pay attention. The Buddhists say when you're stirring the rice, just stir the rice. I want to show you another experiment. So these are vegan meringues that I made with aquafaba. I don't know if on this computer you can see, but they're kind of brownish. And I want to tell you that these are over a week old and they're as crispy as can be, which is something that doesn't happen a lot with meringue. Well, I keep food grade desiccant packages in them, and I keep them in a tin, not in a plastic jar or plastic bag. You want to keep things crispy, you keep them in a tin. You want things to be soft, you put them, in a plastic bag. What I did was, we have so much fun in Essential Vegan Desserts with the aquafaba meringue. And I'm glad, Vicki, that your friend is feeling better. They will continue to feel better. This is her whole food plant-based friend. Anyway, we use very finely ground cane sugar, organic vegan cane sugar, to make this meringue. And it works a charm, as long as you follow the rules, reduce and chill the aquafaba, and so on. Well, I started thinking one day, for no particular reason, things just come to me when I'm not expecting them to, about Italian meringue, which is boiling. You make a sugar syrup and you add it to the meringue. And because there are people who don't want to use cane sugar, I wanted to see what would happen if I used maple syrup. I wasn't going to use maple syrup right in the meringue, but I cooked it as if I was cooking a sugar syrup. I let it come to a boil. When you're boiling syrups, your pot better be a lot higher than you think, because the syrups really climb. And I did that. I let it cool down a little bit. And then with the beater going, I added it to the meringue, not knowing if it was going to work. And it worked. It really worked. I actually didn't love the flavor. Tasted mapley, but there was something about it I didn't love. But the next day and the next day, I liked it better. So there's something that I learned. And how do you learn? You learn by trying. Are you going to have to get rid of some things? Probably. So as I said, and Linda also said, cut the recipes down. If you are a person who cannot have flour, sweeteners, any of the granulated sweeteners, any of the liquid sweeteners, starches, there are still desserts that you can make. Don't try to make a cake that's not going to taste good. You're not going to be happy. Your guests won't be happy. Your family and friends won't be happy. Make a beautiful poached pear, a baked apple. Learn to do a lovely gelled dessert. There's a very lightly gelled fruit soup, loaded up with fruit, a little bit of cream, and you're good to go. So there's lots of ways to do it. You can make a truffle. If you can eat chocolate, There's no sugar added, so it's a high percentage chocolate, some non-dairy milk. You bake the ganache the right way, and that's a little treat. And I like my desserts on the really small side. So I think I've covered what I wanted to cover. I want to thank everybody for being here today, for listening and for watching, and the questions were really great. I'm looking forward to working with my new group of students. The next course starts in May, I think May the 4th, but I'm not positive. I know that there is a discount right now on the Ruby courses. Remember that you can reach out to me at fran@ruby.com for any questions. Look at my website for some more recipe ideas. And again, thank you very much for being here. Until next time.